Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And as a kid, I loved cartoons and comics as much as anyone my age. I certainly hope I've made my love of superhero comics abundantly clear on this channel so far. But my formative years weren't all cartoons, kid shows, and Disney movies. I actually had other guilty pleasures as a kid that weren't as common, and one of them was sitcoms. Now, I'm not just referring to the popular or iconic ones that were on during my youth. There was actually a time in my life where I would literally watch any sitcom that happened to be on TV at the moment. It didn't matter if the premise was stupid or if the acting was awful. I still watched them. And I enjoyed them for the most part. I certainly have my favorites, Married with Children and Malcolm in the Middle being at the top of that list. But a big part of my love of sitcoms came from how I watched them. As it just so happens, my wonderful mother also enjoyed sitcoms. And we often watched them together on weeknights. She even let me watch a few sitcoms with themes that weren't exactly kid-friendly. But that didn't stop us from laughing hysterically at episodes of Seinfeld together. Yes, much of the comedy might have been over my head, but I still thought it was funny. But as much fun as they were, I also gleaned some less than helpful lessons from those shows. Unlike cartoons and kids' shows, sitcoms often involve real people who deal with real-life situations. Now, I might not have been the smartest kid on the block, but I knew a show that involved superheroes, killer robots, and talking turtles was not realistic. Most kids with functional brains know that. But sitcoms were always a bit trickier. When the people are real and the scenarios look real, your inexperienced brain can't always make sense of it. And even as an adult, the messages of sitcoms can become muddled at times. And since I probably watched more sitcoms as a kid than most people did as adults, I think I've been exposed to those misguided messages more than most. As a result, I learned plenty of terrible life lessons that did not help as I grew up and navigated the real world. Now, I'm not saying that sitcoms were a reason for my problems. I think that, in terms of the bigger picture, the themes of these shows tend to get complicated when it clashes with the real world. And in the same way fairy tales and porn create unrealistic expectations, sitcoms also present false assumptions for making sense of the world around you. So, with all that in mind, here are 5 of those terrible lessons that I surmised from my excessive sitcom consumption. And if you have other lessons you'd like to add, please share them in the comments. Some sitcoms do tell better lessons than others, but these are just some of the worst. Now, this particular lesson preyed off my inherent love of romance. While superhero comics offered plenty in terms of deep romance and relatable melodrama, sitcoms tended to be a bit more limited, thanks largely to their half-hour format and limited set pieces. Now, I admit that's a tough, but not insurmountable limitation. Some sitcoms have managed to pull off quality romantic subplots. Unfortunately, way too many sitcoms rely on a heavily flawed, very incomplete concept of romance. And the most common, not to mention the most overdone, involve romances that begin as friendships. Shows like Friends built almost every meaningful romance around this concept. And while it wasn't the only sitcom to do this, it was by far the worst offender in my opinion. It sent a clear message that an epic romance starts with a great friendship. Now, I don't deny that friendship can be a stepping stone to romance, but it's not the only stepping stone, and it's not always the best either. And I admit that does make for good TV, it's also a very flawed approach to the real world. Now again, I'm not saying that being friends can't lead to meaningful romance, it certainly can. I know couples in real life that started off as friends, but became romantically involved. Some are still married to this day. But shows like Friends give the impression that this is the only kind of romance that has true depth. And every other romance just seems flat and uninspiring by comparison. Now, in the real world, seeking friendship is a good thing. But using that as a precursor to romance can come off as deceitful and dishonest. Sometimes a person actually does want a friend more than a love interest, but if that's the only reason you're friends with someone, well, then that just comes off as insincere. And even a little creepy. It's a reason why this particular trope hasn't aged particularly well. Again, that's not to say that sitcoms don't contain meaningful lessons for romance, but this just isn't one of them. Another common trope of sitcoms involves the conflicting motivations of the characters involved. Whether it's Charlie Harper looking to hook up with a new woman in 2.5 Men, or Kelly Bundy trying to win a modeling gig and Married with Children, the motivations of the characters are rarely that complicated, and conflict often arises when they encounter others whose interests aren't aligned with theirs. In a typical half-hour sitcom, complete with room for commercial breaks and sponsors, there's often little room for characters whose agendas have nothing to do with that of the main characters. Because unlike real life, everyone around these main characters is looking to either help or thwart their efforts with very little in between. It's almost unheard of to have anyone who just wants to live their life and doesn't care if someone like Kelly Bundy gets a modeling gig for a pest control company. In these various sitcom worlds, people just can't be that decent to one another. And while it does make logistical sense within the context of a sitcom plot, it also carries some nasty implications for the real world. It fosters a mentality that anyone who isn't helping you is somehow actively opposing you. And that us versus them mentality can and often does bring out the worst in people. You need only look at the state of political discourse since 2016 to see proof of that. But we don't just see it in politics. We see it in how people conduct themselves, treating everyone around them as a potential threat or enemy if their interests don't completely align with theirs. It's downright paranoid, but in sitcoms it's usually played for laughs. But at least in the fictional world, that mentality is somewhat justified. Because it is often the case that the people around these characters, including close friends and family, really do have ulterior motives. For someone like Kelly Bundy, her brother and parents are almost always obstacles to her goals. The same goes for Michael Bluth in Arrested Development, or Bart Simpson in The Simpsons. It's both predictable and somewhat tragic in that close family members are usually the ones who screw you over the worst. And that is an objectively unhealthy perspective when it comes to dealing with the real world. Because if you can't trust your own family, then who can you honestly trust? When it comes to villains or antagonists, there's rarely room for nuance in a sitcom. Most of the time, you're not going to find a Walter White, a Saul Goodman, or even a Magneto within those constraints. Again, you're dealing with a limited format, restricted to a half-hour time slot with room for commercial breaks. So most of the time, bad guys within those stories are going to be painfully obvious. Now that in and of itself isn't too big a problem. Villains don't have to be complex to work, even in a sitcom. But if a sitcom does have a villain of any kind, it's almost guaranteed to be an authority figure. It can be a parent, a teacher, or even an older sibling. If a character has even a shred of authority over another, no matter how arbitrary it might be, you can usually assume they're going to abuse it to the utmost, while usually opposing the protagonist of a show every step of the way. Whether it's Red Foreman clamping down on pot smoking in That 70s Show, or Lois being a tyrannical mom and Malcolm in the Middle, the authority figures in these shows are always the problem. And there's often not a whole lot of depth to their antagonism. They tend to exist solely to prevent the main characters from having fun or achieving their goals, whatever they may be. It can't be possible that they think they know what's best for someone, or that they're genuinely concerned about what others are doing. These are just embittered authority figures looking to clamp down on fun while flexing their power. Now, I am not going to claim that authority figures can't be corrupt. There are plenty of real-life instances of authority figures acting like full-fledged villains. But there are also plenty of cases of authority figures doing genuine good. Whether it's the leader of a country or the chief of a police unit, it is actually possible for someone to wield authority over others and not be an asshole. The problem is that story just rarely makes for a good sitcom. And if your understanding of authority comes solely from sitcoms, then claiming anyone with authority can be good is like claiming pigs can do algebra. In the world of sitcoms, it's not just that power corrupts. Any kind of power corrupts, and it always does so absolutely. It's as simplistic as it is absurd, lacking any sense of nuance, context, or perspective. Because in reality, there are authority figures worthy of respect. And more often than not, sitcoms go out of their way to avoid that point. In the same way sitcoms often present a simplistic view of authority figures and villains, they take an equally bland approach when it comes to bullies. And for the most part, bullies in sitcoms aren't really characters. They might as well be robots programmed to insult, denigrate, or annoy the main characters at every turn. There's rarely any deeper motivation beyond that. They're just mean, unrepentant assholes, plain and simple. Characters like Libby Chesler in Sabrina the Teenage Witch, or Harley Keener in Boy Meets World don't exist to give depth to a sitcom. They're just there to present obstacles and setbacks for the main characters. Giving them a reason for being a bully, be it a personality disorder or past trauma, would only hinder their ability to achieve that function. Again, this does make sense within the context of plotting a sitcom, but it grossly simplifies the actual concept of bullying in the real world. And when it does manifest, it is nothing like what we see in a sitcom. And I know this because I dealt with bullies in my childhood. I can confirm that it did not play out like any sitcom I ever saw. Because in the real world, bullies aren't robots fueled by the whimpering cries of their victims. They are human beings too. And while few people are inclined to sympathize with bullies, very few people are ever actually born as bullies. And that's an important perspective, because nobody comes out of the womb that way. They may not even see themselves as bullies from their perspective. There are often so many deeper complexities to the mental makeup of a bully, ranging from mental illness to just having unhealthy social skills. But sitcoms love to pretend that those complexities don't exist. Granted, it's difficult for a half-hour TV show to explore and flesh out the personality of a bully. It's just a whole lot easier to make them an unlikable asshole who helps glorify the main character. And as a result, it's easy to see bullies as blunt instruments rather than people you need to deal with in your day-to-day life. And in such a complicated world full of complicated people, it's bound to cause problems beyond losing your lunch money. Let's not lie to ourselves. Whether we're kids or adults, we rarely appreciate the value of hard work. Hell, most of us go out of our way to avoid it. And when we can't, we're often inclined to take the path of least resistance in terms of getting it done. And many sitcoms do accurately reflect this sentiment. They certainly aren't the main reason why people avoid hard work. That inclination existed long before the advent of sitcoms. But sitcoms do have a tendency to take it to extremes that can be both hilarious and a bit asinine. Because in the world of sitcoms, hard work is often framed as something akin to waterboarding. It's neither desirable nor pleasant. In many cases, it seems like outright torture. From Lucy standing on an assembly line in I Love Lucy, to the over-the-top slacker behavior that plays out in shows like Workaholics, hard work is often a step down from having root canal surgery at the dentist. It's something a major character either avoids or gets crushed by. Many sitcoms even build entire plots around characters looking for a way to get out of hard work. I would even argue that Francis in Malcolm in the Middle is the perfect personification of this struggle. He once spent an entire episode willingly distracting himself from an overdue history assignment. And while characters like him often pay a price for their slacking, it's rarely framed as being worse than the alternative, which involves actually working hard. And therein lies the problem. In the twisted world of sitcoms, you only ever work hard if you have your dream job. And since most people don't ever get their dream job, hard work is basically like admitting defeat. It's not something you want to do, it's something you have to do when you can't get out of it. That's the main takeaway from most sitcoms. But anyone with just a small amount of life experience knows how flawed that is. Again, I have some real life experience with this. When I was working a part-time job in high school that I absolutely hated, I still learned the value of a hard day's work. It taught me some important lessons, namely that there were certain jobs I wanted to avoid later in life. But having to do those jobs and having to work that hard, it's not a failure or defeat. It's usually a means to an end, and it's something that, when done right and approached with the right perspective, can still give you a sense of genuine accomplishment. And while we all can't approach work with the same passion as Hank Hill when he sells propane and propane accessories, hard work still has value. But sitcoms would have you believe that value doesn't exist. Now, having shared all these terrible life lessons, let me make one thing clear. I still enjoy sitcoms. I still watch them regularly when there aren't any superhero movies or TV shows to watch. While they can still be funny and entertaining in their own quirky way, there's no denying that they present a very flawed concept of life, people, and how to handle it. I get that they're not supposed to be accurate reflections of real life. They're an entertainment product. If they were too real, nobody would watch them. But that doesn't change the fact that some of the messages they convey are inaccurate, absurd, and sometimes downright unhealthy. Because real life has no laugh track. The various problems and challenges we face can't be resolved within 30 minutes while making time for commercial breaks. And most people in the real world, regardless of whether they live in New York City, Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, or South London, their lives aren't going to be anything like what we see in sitcoms. Most of the time, their lives will be fairly mundane, with a few major upheavals along the way. And very little of that existence will make for a good sitcom. That's a big part of why sitcoms have so much appeal in the first place. They take life as we know it and give it this fanciful touch, along with a dash of comedy. And when done right, it can make for some genuinely wonderful entertainment that can go on for many seasons. But like it or not, there are still plenty of bad lessons to be learned, even from great sitcoms. That's something kids and adults can appreciate. But even with these terrible lessons, if these shows can still find a way to make us laugh, then I say that's a price worth paying. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, take care and stay safe.